my God. Hi, Sanjana.
Hi, Sneha.
Welcome to Money Meets Emotions, episode number 2, where I get to introduce the wonderful Sanjana Sekhar. Sanjana is a South Indian American filmmaker, author, and climate activist. She's a storyteller who aims to make climate action the hottest place to be, literally and figuratively. Her focus is really on reclaiming and healing extractive narratives to instead build a healthy human future on Earth. Because how's that not sexy? And her first feature documentary is Expedition Reclamation, and it follows 12 everyday Black, Indigenous, and women of color to redefine outdoorsy and reclaim what it means to belong in outdoor recreation. So without further ado, hi Sanjana!
Hi, Sneha. Thank you so much for having me today.
Of course. And before we even get into the core of the interview, which is of course about like money and emotions and privilege and capitalism, I want folks to kind of have a backstory on who you are. So, who are you? How did you come into these spaces of filmmaking and storytelling and activism?
Sure, great question. So, I sometimes wonder that myself. I feel like I've been in this space for as long as I can remember, and I don't always remember what my origin story is. And then recently, my mom reminded me that when I was 3 years old and we were living in Bombay, I was in this school play and I played a fairy. And in the play, all of the flowers, which were all the other kids, they were dying because of pollution. And my role was to be the little fairy that came in and brought them all back to life.
Oh my God,
So
that's
I
so
feel like,
sweet.
yeah, it's so cute. And then I feel like I lived many lives since then, and then somehow now, as an adult, have come all the way back to what my three-year-old self was initially doing, which is, oh, I actually care about climate, and I care about it through a storytelling and art perspective and activism perspective. So, in recently, I've been like, was that my origin story? Maybe it
Oh my
was. I'm
God.
not
I
sure.
always feel like there's a story that happens like when you're 3 and then it translates to your 26-year-old self. You're like, I'm having a quarter life crisis. Let me remember what I was like at 3 or 4, you know?
Yeah. I feel like those experiences maybe they bake into us in ways we don't even realize until we're much
Yeah.
older because I definitely at 3 years old was not the one writing that story or directing that
Yeah.
story or saying we should even do that story, but being a part of it must have somehow embedded in my psyche because here we are. And I feel
Yeah,
like
it's like that subliminal messaging.
yeah, and I think that the sort of like solutionist lens is something I'm really interested in and what I focus on as much as I can. So I feel
Yeah.
like maybe there's something there. But more practically speaking, I've been working in the storytelling space since I graduated college, so about 8 years now. And it's been through a lot of different lenses, literature, film, and film from a documentary perspective mostly. Also, a lot of films with partners and organizations that work in climate justice. And then a lot of other sort of like writing, speaking, just things with words, and the
Yeah.
whole idea is how do we talk about really incredible work that's going on in the climate space in ways that feel relatable to people, everyday people who might not identify as activists themselves, but are definitely affected by all of these systems and structures and changes that are going on in the world.
That's so powerful. Yeah, I think something really cool about storytelling is that folks don't realize the impact of things until it kind of affects them. And I think that's kind of similar to even like money and emotions, right? People are like, money is logical, money is rational, but you know that money is emotional once you realize how it impacts your life every single
Mm.
day, right?
Yeah, that's a
I,
great point.
and I think it's so powerful when you can see that there's relatability for climate change for every single person in this world. And obviously, it disproportionately affects other people more than others, but it still impacts every single person every day. How are you using your like takeout containers? How are you like getting to work or school every single day? So that's really powerful.
Yeah, for sure. And I think honestly, at its core, climate is a class issue. And so climate and money go really hand in hand because it's a question of resources and a question of how resources are used and who has power to dictate how those resources are used and who's affected
Yeah.
by those decisions. So yeah, I think they really go hand in hand and similar, like you just mentioned with money, where people say it's about logic, it's not about emotion. I think a lot of people would say climate is about science, it's not about the heart and the
Yes.
spirit. But really,
Yes.
it is about the heart and the spirit because I always say this that there's an idea that people have that storytelling is a soft skill, right? That it's like a nice floofy thing that people do. Um, when they have the privilege to do so. And I think that that could not be further from the truth, because I think storytelling is actually a essential survival mechanism. It's also something that is a hard skill, where the words in our mind and the words on the page and the words that we see around us, those are the things that dictate how we move behaviorally. They dictate the physical structures that we build in our built environment. They also dictate the political and social structures that we build from the perspective of like the nation state and whatnot. So I think these are all narratives, and
Yeah.
when we have certain dominant narratives, the world looks a certain way, and when we start to shift that
They
narrative,
always say like the winner always tells the story, right?
exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that's what we're seeing literally too. I mean, there's a lot of
Yeah.
money and billionaires who own media companies, for example. And so who's controlling those narratives? Who owns social
Relevant.
media, where a lot of us get our information and disinformation and things like that? So I think money plays a really big role in shaping the world, not just in terms of transactions, but in terms of what gets visibility. And I
Yeah.
think that's why a lot of the incredible solutionist work that's already going on doesn't really get visibility, because it's a threat to the system as it currently is. So there's a lot we can dig into
I know, I was just
in
going to
that
say, like, this is
intersection between,
quite
yeah,
literally the core of what we're
yeah.
going to talk about today, which is so exciting.
Mhm.
But before we even get into that, I do want to ask you, what pulled you towards working as a climate activist, as a storyteller, and not going down the conventional 9 to 5 path of working in corporate or working like a more traditional job? Like, you are truly a full-time creative.
Yeah, I mean, I actually would love to work a 9 to 5 traditional job. I just feel like this felt more pressing, and I felt that not only is it more pressing, but I'm somebody with the unique opportunity to go do that. I think a lot of people are impacted by these issues, but maybe don't have the same chance for resourcing reasons to make it their full time job. Or maybe they do, but there's a lot of struggle inherent in that. And I felt like I had this unique intersection of being financially secure because of the privilege that I have, and being aware of things that need more resourcing. So I was like, how can I take my time and energy and put it towards these things, because I'm someone who can do that, right? And so
Yeah.
it was like the urgency of it combined with the fact that I was like, oh, I can actually raise my hand for that job because I can afford to do that. And yeah, so I think it was a matter of circumstance in a lot of ways too.
Yeah, and I love that you're using your privilege for good, because I think there's a lot of people who have privilege, and it's really a choice of how you choose to go forward with that, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's interesting. I feel like part of why I felt capable of doing that is because privilege is not a generational thing in my family. Like, I am probably the first person, first generation, first person in my immediate family to experience financial security. And so because financial insecurity is something that my mom experienced, it's very near in our family's history. It's not like,
Hmm. Okay.
it's not like we've had money for generations like that. And I think because of that, it feels like a little bit easier to um, take that risk, because it's not like I come from generations where we've been comfortable and sedated, you know?
Oh, that's
Like,
so
I think,
interesting. Yeah.
I think that if I had come from generational wealth, then it might have been easier to just continue on, like to keep on keeping
Hmm.
on and to not really engage too deeply in it. Um, but because maybe sometimes that practice gets a little bit lost, but I feel like because that's not what I come from, when I realize that I do have this financial privilege, I'm able to say like, oh, okay, how do we use it, right? And
Yeah.
it's like the muscle is still a little bit there. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's me
Yeah.
right now, though. Who knows? Like in a few decades, if I have a family of my own and the responsibilities are different, I know things change all the time. I just feel
Of
like
course.
right now, I don't have
You're
any.
young, you have the ability to go and just,
Exactly.
they always say
Exactly.
when you're in your 20s, just go out there and build anything that
Right.
you really want to, because you really have no responsibilities compared to later in life.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. And I'm 29, so now my sort of priorities are starting to shift, and I'm aware of that. But I think that, like, when we decide to engage in activism, it doesn't have to be a decision where we're like, for the rest of my life, this is all I will ever do, right?
Of
Like,
course.
the way that looks can change, especially as your own life and your own circumstances change.
Yeah.
And that is something I think that we need to learn how to do, is like be dynamic with our
Absolutely.
circumstances.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Sanjana.
Mhm.
So, of course, I'm working to create a space where money and emotions can coexist. And as you know, money is really as scary and polarizing as topics like religion and politics. I want to live in a world where there's not as much of a stigma to talk about these things. So I'm so grateful that you even took time to even publicly talk about this stuff with folks who you may not know. But I
Yeah.
really want to talk to you about like what money means to you. So you're such a cool human being. Like you're working in so many different spaces. Like you're in like art and film and writing and environmentalism and social justice. And I would just love to hear like your perspective about what money and privilege and capitalism really mean to you, like from these lenses of like individualism versus
Mm.
community. So one thing I wanted to talk to you about was I was reading Nadir Nadi's, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but his newsletter, and he talks about this book called Real Artists Don't Starve. And I found this idea really delightful because I think in my head, I've had it for so long that to be an artist, it's kind of like you're a struggling artist. Like you don't know when you're going to get the next paycheck, like you're always just like willing to make ends meet. But there's also other creatives that don't really believe in this. And I was just curious, as a full time creative, like where do you stand and how, as a creative, do you view money?
Great question. Did you hear
It's okay. That was such good timing too. It's like ding.
that? That was my reminder for our call because initially we had it at 3.
I love
Um,
that.
but no, that's a really good question. I think that I have a few thoughts about that. I think that I'm sure there are people that are genuinely struggling, starving artists, and I have met some of the people that are able to make it work. Like they just are so passionate, so committed, and that drive somehow leads to success and security, and like hats off. I also think that many of the people that are full-time creatives, myself included, have some kind of safety net or something else that they're doing or some other source of financial security. The issue is that things are so, like you said, money is such a taboo that you never really know what
Totally.
people are
Yeah.
doing to make it work. And I think that that's in some ways I'm like, no, I get it. I don't think that people should have to starve to make art. And I think in an
Yeah.
actually developed country, artists would be able to make a living wage and that would be the baseline. But I think that money is a reality, and I think that art, some of the best art, oftentimes critiques a system, and therefore the system has no incentive to reward it. And I think that's why it's really hard as an artist to find funding sources, to find steady income, is because, especially if you're trying to make work that is questioning powers or interrogating systems, you are not going to necessarily find the money easy because why would a system pay you to question it? So I
Yeah.
think there are a lot of different things that go into play with people that are full-time creatives. Again, a lot of us have something that we're leaning on, whether it's money from parents, money from partners, another side hustle, like something else, or clients, like certain client work that brings in a decent amount of money. There's got to be a way to eat, and then there's got to be a way to make the things you want to make. And I don't think those things very often collide, but they do collide too. And I think it's always a balance. And then there's a lot of people who really are struggling out there and making art. I think both those things are true.
I find that their controversial hot takes are also kind of in line with the contrabands of
Mm,
society, right? They are the rebels that they're the people who are confident enough or ballsy enough, really, to say the things that are on people's minds. And they're just the
yeah.
first people to say that. And then you have the first followers who agree with that. And then groupthink, you have everyone else who follows to say, that is amazing.
Yeah. It's true. I think, and this question goes back as old as art goes back, because even some
Totally.
of the
Yeah.
most famous painters that we know, they had the work that they're famous for and then the work that they were commissioned for that we don't hang in museums because that work was for some nobility, some noble family somewhere, and it was hung up in their house. And yeah, it was painted by someone super famous, but that was his client work, you know?
So that's a good comparison. I like that you say client work and art because I do think those feel like two separate concepts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To me, they are. Yeah. But they
Yeah.
don't always have to be, but I think they often are. Every so often you get lucky that you work with a client who wants to make art, you know,
Yeah.
and that's gold right there. But
That is gold. I guess also more fundamentally, I'm curious to hear how your upbringing has influenced your relationship with money. Because there's a lot of people who say, I had financial insecurity growing up, so a big thing that's important for me is to be financially independent and to prioritize making a lot of money so I don't have to feel the things that my parents felt. So I'm really curious to hear how that influenced you in your career choice too.
yeah, I would say I did not personally ever experience financial insecurity growing
Okay.
up. I experienced financial security, but my mom did not, right? And I think I was
Okay.
raised by somebody who knows what it's like to not have, but I always had. And so I think that was a really interesting
Mm,
combination because the values that I learned were informed by someone who knows what insecurity is like, what resource insecurity is like, but I myself never had to contend with resource
I see.
insecurity. So I had that privilege of
Yes.
having the security, but also having the mentality of someone who might have come from more humble backgrounds. And
Mm,
that was really interesting to me too, because I think that my mom, she always quotes what her dad said, um, which is that money comes and money goes, and you have to know how to live within your means. So I think that's sort of what we learned to do. But I would say again, I grew up in very privileged circles. I think the people that I grew up around, even though we ourselves were not like super, super rich, we were comfortable. But the people I was around, I didn't realize at the time because being an immigrant and coming to this country, you're kind of like, oh, this is just America, right? And that was the
yeah.
only slice of America that I saw was a small town in Connecticut, right outside of New York City, where wealth was just the norm, you know? And like we had a house to me felt very spacious and large and honestly like is pretty spacious, but it was the size of some people's guest houses, right? Like we lived in like a little community where the
Yeah.
houses like your neighbors were right next to you and it was like a
Yeah.
little road, and to me it was amazing. But for a lot of people they had like 2 acre plots of land and big
That sounds very
mansions.
Connecticut.
Yeah, big mansion, big guest house, and I
Yeah.
think in my mind I was like, this is just America. I was like, this is what America looks like. And obviously I learned that's not true. But I think I think it made me really realize that there is such a spread of resources. And when we would go back to India, for example, like we don't live fancy there, you know. And at least like my grandma, my family, like that's not on my mom's side especially, like very chill, small apartment, super cute, been there for like decades.
Oh,
Still have like a water tank that fills every morning with a certain amount of water.
yeah.
And the way that you see like poverty in India, it just sort of like hits different, right? And so I think
Yeah.
growing up, I just saw these like two extremes, like Connecticut and then this, and had no understanding of like what created these things. Like I had no understanding of capitalism and colonialism and the way that those systems have truly like stripped resources from certain places and funneled them into other places, created those inequities. But I think I've just always felt like I had this, like you said, like a privilege to learn more and learn more about these things and an interest in that. And then also a lot of support from my family and my mom, especially in saying, like, I gave you financial security so that you can explore what you want. And we would talk about that a lot because I think for me, there was and there is oftentimes still a lot of guilt around that where I spend more time being guilty for having privilege than like doing something valuable with my privilege. And she really sat me down and she was like, I made the sacrifices that I made to build you this financial security, not so you can sit here and feel guilty, but so you can use it, right? And the implication is like if
Wow, I
she
love
had
your
had,
mom.
I know
She
she's
sounds
amazing.
amazing.
She is something else, I swear to God, straight from the heavens. But But, I think about the fact that like what she's basically saying to me is like she did not have that security growing up. And so she did not have choices growing up. And so she was not able to act on things that she might have felt really passionate about growing up because something else was more pressing.
Yeah.
And she has taken that worry off the table for me so that I can therefore go and pursue the thing that is calling, and I think she has a really unique way of looking at it because a lot of people, like you said, it's like if we've amassed a certain amount of wealth and security for the first time, let's keep going. Let's
Yeah.
keep getting more. And I
Yeah.
understand that too. Like I honestly, I get that mentality. I don't even judge it. I think it's just like two different ways of looking at the purpose of security and the purpose of money. I think I've always felt like, okay, if I'm someone who does have this privilege, I better fucking use it. You know what I mean? Like, otherwise, what's the point? So I'm trying. I don't know if I'm always doing a good job, but I'm trying.
Sanjana, I can reassure you, you're doing a great job. Honestly, that was so moving. Your mom has like the utmost like unconditional love for you, and it's like
She
it's showing
does.
because like I see that reflecting off of you of
Yeah.
how you view the world too. So
She's
that
amazing. Honestly, you should get her on here. Like, let me leave and you can
I'm
bring her.
so down.
She could speak to this stuff so beautifully too. I always joke with her. I'm like, so many people come to this country with very little and they build security for themselves and then suddenly they find that their wants and their needs and their desires bloom alongside their wealth, right? And like
Yeah,
before you know it, you
that's like
want
lifestyle creep at its finest.
exactly. That is the terminology, lifestyle creep. And my mom somehow just like, I don't know what she did. I always joke with her. I'm like, they forgot something with you because
I
she
honestly, I get that. I feel like that might be like an Indian mom thing because that's true for my
maybe,
mom too. And like
yeah,
I think my mom taught me sustainability and not to waste things. And she didn't call
100%.
it sustainability. She was just like, that's what
Right.
you do.
It's just the norm because why would you
Yeah.
waste when you can't necessarily count on the fact that you can just buy more or take more or whatever, right? Like
Yeah.
you're gonna not
Yeah,
waste.
even my mom, when there's wasted food, she's like, we cannot waste food. Like that
Oh,
is brought to
yes,
from the sky. And I'm like, Mom,
I
you're
agree.
totally right.
I would get plates returned to me if they had 1 grain of rice. My mom would be like,
Yes.
finish this. And I would be like, I did. And I wouldn't even see the rice. And she'd be like, no, you didn't. Look right there. And when I was a kid, I was so annoyed. Or she would run
Oh,
behind
yeah,
me.
same.
She would like turn the tap down. Like she wouldn't turn it off. She would just turn it lower. Like less water. You don't need this much water for this. And I would get so annoyed. And now I work in the space and I'm like, damn, that woman knew from day one. She knew, right? Like, I don't know how,
The
yeah.
theory here is that moms are just all knowing. I think
Hundred,
that's what I
yeah,
have to say.
100%. Yeah. And she's so funny because now, like, you would think she would be sitting here, like, wanting all of the finer comforts in life. And literally, I laugh with her about this all the time. Her only real craving or desire in the entire world is for roasted, unsalted peanuts. That's all she wants. That's all she needs. That's all she
Wait,
wants.
protect her at all costs. She needs to be
I know.
protected.
I'm like, that's what her birthday was just this past weekend. I just got her like a giant thing of roasted, unsalted peanuts,
Happy
dry
belated
roasted,
birthday,
unsalted
Mrs.
peanuts.
Shaker. Oh my
Yeah.
God. Oh, that's so
Anyway.
sweet. Okay, next podcast guest.
Yeah,
Next
right. No,
podcast.
for real. Like, let me bring her in.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I feel like that just kind of shows to me how you view money. I feel like you have a very stable relationship with it where it's not
Mm,
all good versus not all bad. But I don't want to even put words in your mouth. I am curious
yeah.
to hear when you hear the word money versus when you hear the word wealth, what kind of emotions trigger in you, just as
Mm,
a human, more than just being a storyteller or being a climate activist. Because I feel like wealth and money come with a lot of emotions, especially as being in the sustainability space, right?
yeah. No, great question. I do still think I have a lot of fear around money and a lot of guilt around money. I think that when I am talking with you about it, for example, I'm able to process some of it and come to like wiser conclusions. But I would say emotionally, on a day-to-day basis, I still feel like I think as immigrant children, oftentimes there's a sense of guilt where you're like, oh my God, my parents sacrificed so much for me. And like, here I am being like, save the planet,
Yeah, I
And my
wish I could do
mom's
like
been
the
out here.
chest emoji right now. Like, yes, yes.
Yeah, right? Like I think I still struggle with that and I think I probably will for a long time. I think she and I have had enough conversations about it at this point that I see the light beyond that
There's
guilt and I
hope. Yeah.
understand the purpose better now. but I still, my gut feeling, or like my, like the core feeling, I still struggle with feeling like I don't know why I deserve this, and like you didn't have this growing up, but suddenly I have this. Like, how does that make sense, you know?
Yeah.
But I also understand that that's kind of a waste of energy sometimes. I
Yeah.
mean, it's okay to feel it, but like to stay in it, I think is a bit of a waste of energy. So I would
Yeah,
say,
it's that healthy, it's like healthy form of fear slash healthy form of guilt allows you to like extend that empathy towards other people to be as though I have that privilege, so I want to extend that on other people, but
yeah,
not to the point that it debilitates you from taking any action.
right, right. Because I do feel like I still struggle with a bit of a scarcity mindset around it. And it's really ironic because I, again, have not personally experienced financial insecurity. So why do I have that scarcity mindset? Whereas my
Yeah, but I
mom, who
find
has,
scarcity mindset's very interesting because I've, especially with my own friends too, I see that I have folks that have grown up in upper middle class and they have scarcity mindset, and I know
yeah,
folks who grew up dirt poor and they have the most abundance
abundant mindset.
mindset that
Yeah,
I've ever seen before. It does not matter
100%.
how much money you've come from.
100%. Because I think part of it too is like the more you have, the more insulated you feel from like you lose trust with yourself that you could survive without what you have or with
Yes.
any less than what you have. You're like, I've gotten used to this. If I don't have this, everything's going to crumble. And so you hold
Yeah.
on as tight as you can. Whereas if you have lived a range of experiences or you've lived without, you're like, I know how I can figure this out, you know? And
Yeah.
that's not to like glorify
No, no.
not having
Yeah.
resources because obviously
It's tough.
that's
Yeah.
not something I would wish upon anybody.
Yeah.
But I do, yeah, I do notice like even when it comes to activism, I notice that oftentimes the people that are first to be out in the streets, the people who are first to be out to help are the people who are not the richest people in the world, you know? Like I feel like it takes people with privilege a lot to get over the inertia and to like take
That's such a
themselves
good
out
word,
of places of
inertia.
comfort,
Yes.
you know? It's like I'm so comfortable, like I could just sit on my couch and like scroll and learn about it through my screen, whereas like people who are not doing who are maybe not coming from that much privilege are already out there. Like they're the people on your
Classrooms.
screen that you're
Yes.
seeing on your screen in the news who are like even the mutual aid stuff, right? It's like immediately people mobilized, and a lot of the people who mobilized are working class people.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people who maybe didn't mobilize are celebrities. Like I didn't see
Oh
them.
my God, yes.
You
And
know?
I don't know if you've watched this show Silo. It's a Apple TV
I
show.
love Silo. Yeah.
So good. I feel like it
Yeah.
touches so much on
Mhm.
classism. And for folks who have not watched the show, the lower class is called the down deep. And you
Mhm.
see in moments of toughness, that is the community that is coming together to give other people food when they themselves do not have food to give. I just thought that was a
Yeah.
good analogy to like that is
100%.
quite literally what we see in real life too. People
Yeah.
can have $5 in their bank account, not come from much, and still I see in New York City people are giving money to other people on the subway with not
Mhm.
even coming from that much either. So,
Yeah, it's so true. I think it's just a question of like the muscle again, right? It's like if
mhm.
you are someone who still has access to that muscle of collective care, then you're like, I'm in it, I'm here. But if you're someone who's gotten really used to like protecting yourself and protecting what's quote unquote yours, then you've started operating with disconnection and it's much harder to find a way back in.
I know my dad always says this thing where he's like, you can have $5 in your bank account or $1 million in your bank account. If you can't give with $5, you're not going to give with $1 million. And I was like,
Wow.
that is fucking facts, Dad. Like,
Damn.
preach to the choirs.
That's good. Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah, and you actually just touched on exactly what I want to move on to next, which is money on a collective level. So, as
Mm,
Americans, we really are folks that like prioritize individualism, or at least that's what we think, like to think, right? Like a lot of the self-help books, like everything that we see out there is from the lens of individualism. And you got to take care of yourself before you can take care of others, which to a certain extent, if you are yourself debilitated, it is hard to take care of other people. But that being said, I think sometimes that phrase can be taken a bit too far, where it's we get too comfortable in like the state that we're being and we're not helping other people that actually are in need. So how do you look at money for the collective? So why do you think so many people look at profit versus impact as always like this zero-sum game?
that's a really good question. I think that the reason we look at, let's say, sustainability or to put it more broadly, the idea of life-giving systems, right? versus capitalism, the reason that we see those two things as opposed is in some ways fine, they are, right? But like the reason that sustainability and initiatives towards climate action are seen as a zero-sum game in contrast with profit is very much because of a marketing campaign that was paid for by fossil fuel companies, namely Exxon, right? In like the 90s and 2000s, they put a lot of money into like articles in the newspaper that were secretly advertisements and a whole host of other marketing things that essentially were trying to not only sort of create a haze around climate science and make it seem questionable, but also climate science, by the way, that like their own company participated in decades before, where their own scientists were like, if we burn fossil fuels, it's going to lead to greenhouse gas accumulation, which will lead to climate catastrophe. So their own scientists agreed with that, and then a few decades later, or however long later, in the 90s and 2000s, they ran a lot of advertising around trying to, create doubt around those facts. In addition to creating doubt around the science of climate action, they also ran advertisements that were intended to show people or tell people or convince people that taking steps towards climate action was going to slow down the economy and was going to be a threat to economic growth. And so the reason that we still, literally like 2 decades later, still come up against people who will argue this, who will say, if we take this measure, XYZ measure, towards climate action, profits will fall and or the economy will go to hell and or blah, blah, blah. That is directly because of documented influence from the fossil fuel industry. So I don't think that is an accident. I don't think it is because people are stupid. I think it's because there's been a deliberate campaign to control the narrative when it comes to money and climate change. And it's, in my opinion, it's super delusional because I'm like, actually, what's really expensive are climate crises that we can't control. And we have no say in these things. We have a say in action. We have a say in how we spend money proactively. We have no say in how we have to spend money reactively to address things like these LA fires, which are right now the most expensive natural, quote unquote, disaster that the United States has ever seen, right? So I'm like, what's expensive? What's bad for the economy? What's bad for profit is climate catastrophe. So isn't it better to invest your money in things that are going to mitigate those things and adapt us to what's coming rather than, oh shit, we had no idea, now we got to clean up, right? And like the cleanup is really expensive and a lot of people, you're losing houses, you're losing the ability to work, you're losing lives, you're losing health, and like, that sounds really expensive to me, So it's just a narrative issue, honestly.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I think there was some study done with different politicians where they say something where it's not a fact. And if someone hears it, and then right after that, they hear that the fact is actually like a lie, most of the people, I would love to like get a stat on this, but most people would actually still believe what the person said before that. Like narrative has such a powerful impact on how people view facts and view stories. It makes sense as to why there is so much distrust around climate change.
100%. That's also, like, it's because fossil fuel, like scientists employed by the fossil fuel industry, right, as a whole, had come to the conclusion decades ago that doing business as usual was going to cause climate catastrophe. That's why a lot of these companies are getting sued now, because the basis of the lawsuits is like, y'all knew. And here's the proof that y'all knew. There's like these leaked inside documents and whatnot. It's like, you knew back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you knew what was going to happen and you kept doing it anyway. And you hid it, like you actively hid it and you actively lied about it. And now it's too late for us to save a lot of things. It's not too late for us to save everything, but like certain things, it's like already, we tick-tocked that clock. And so I think, and so I think that is something I wish more people knew, is like it affects us on a daily basis, not even in the ways we get to work and the things that we, throw away containers and stuff like that, but also just in like our healthcare systems. And like right now, I'm breathing this really toxic air, this carcinogenic air probably. Luckily, I have an air purifier, but every time I go outside, that's a risk, right? And like I get mad because I'm like, someone else has decided this for me. Someone else, because of their money, because of their influence, and because of their addiction to money, they've decided to stay in this delusion that we can continue doing things. We can, pursue infinite growth on a planet with finite resources. And because of their delusional decision making, I'm over here breathing in carcinogens, and who knows what that's going to mean for my health in the long term. Who knows what that's going to mean for my wallet in the long term, because healthcare costs are exorbitant in this country. And so yeah, it's frustrating because you're like, these, such and such billionaire and such other billionaire have all been in cahoots and have like made decisions about the world on my behalf that I do not agree with. And those decisions impact, forget like plastic straws, they impact the air I'm breathing and the water I'm drinking and like my wallet, because if the water's not clean, I have to buy a filter. If the air is not clean, I have to buy a purifier. Like,
Yes.
and like I'm just like over it. I'm like, no, thank you.
Yeah, I feel like that is such a clear delineation between money for the collective versus money for the individual,
I
right? Like
forgot that's where we
greed.
started.
I, I know. Like this is greed is quite literally money for the individual taken on steroids, right?
Yeah.
People making decisions. And there is fact behind money talks, like that phrase, money talks,
Hmm.
right? Like we see even with regulation, the fact that our favorite Tesla CEO is able to have so much power in the government as a tech
Hmm.
CEO, having influence,
Who also
having
owns a media company, let's not forget, right?
oh yes,
Like,
of course, we
again,
can't
thinking about
forget about that
narratives.
either.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you see how much it really is money influencing all of these things. And money can be something that can be used for good. Like we said, mutual aid, being able to give
Hmm.
other people good things. But it's not always, especially in America, it's not always viewed for the collective. Or at least that's kind of it's kind of like social media where we hear the fringe. We also see the fringe where large sums of money are used for more negative than it is for positive.
Yeah, 100%. And I feel like this idea that money talks, I'm like, all right, if money talks, let's make it say something better, you know?
Yeah.
That's my
Yeah, and I
thing.
feel like that segues me into asking you about how do you operate as a climate activist in a capitalistic society? Because obviously we live in America. I don't know if that's going to change for you, but how does that like kind of impact how you look at the world?
I feel like I'm in the belly of the beast, And I'm like, all right, let's go. I think I think a lot of people, and maybe I've done this in the past too, but I think there can sometimes be a tendency to wallow in lament, where it's like,
Yeah.
money. And I get it. I think probably at my core, I feel the same way. But you have to at some point just kind of like look at it as a fact and not feel any type of way about it. Like you just got to be like, okay, money talks, and there are rich people, and the world is controlled by billionaires. And like that is the reality, period. Like that's what's happening right now. I can run from it, I can hide from it, it won't stop it being true.
Yeah.
So if I can instead just like face that fear and face that fact and be like, this is what's happening, I can then be like, okay, and so now what? You
Yeah, you
know?
become more solution oriented rather than just wallowing in the
Yeah. You
fear.
can't be
Yeah.
solutions oriented if you're not looking at the problem, right? I think
Mhm.
that's a big part of it too, is like you just gotta
You
be
can't
real
deny
about the
it.
problem. Yeah, and I feel like as a climate activist in a capitalist society, like I don't waste too much time thinking about hypocrisies because they're gonna happen. Like I live within a system that I'm trying to change. And so do a lot of other people. And that's inherently how change happens. Like, it's not like it would be very, very egotistical of me to think that I am somehow out of the grasp of capitalism's influence. That's
Of
not true.
course.
I'm a
Yes.
human
Yeah.
being. I'm going to be also a part of the system. That doesn't mean that I'm not qualified to help build a better system, right? And I
Yeah.
think if all of us realize that like you don't need any qualifications, you just got to be someone who gives a fuck. And
Yes.
that's your qualification. That's your membership card into the club of people that are trying to change things, right? And I think, again, there's going to be inherent hypocrisies. Sometimes I'll be like, the fossil fuel industry's monopoly sucks. And somebody will be like, don't pretend that you don't take a plane. And I'm like, yeah, I take a plane. I want to go see my grandma. That doesn't mean that I don't dream of a world where we can find cleaner transportation. Like I don't need to stop taking planes for me to care about this stuff because I also live in diaspora. I also like to travel the world. I like to see the planet that I want
And
to have.
inhabiting, yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't really waste a lot of time like thinking about that complexity because it just is,
Yeah.
what it is.
Oh, I love that response. I feel like you don't get too philosophical about it. Like one could get philosophical and think so deeply about the intersection between the two of them. And quite frankly, we do live in the intersection
Yeah,
of the two of them. As someone who cares and as someone who has seen like extractive policies being put into place that put people in harm's way. But that
mhm,
doesn't mean that something can't be done about it, right?
exactly. And the thing to me is that the sooner we can stop worrying about the hypocrisies and start worrying about building something better, the better, right? Because I'm like,
Yes.
I just, I don't know what you want me to do. Like, I can't erase myself from capitalist society. I live in it. But that puts me also at a unique position to experiment with how you can change things. And I don't do
Yes.
that alone. I do that under the guidance of people that are way smarter than me and that have been doing this for a much longer time than me. And I just
Yes.
learn from them, right? But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like capitalism, the extractive policies of capitalism, like that is what has caused this climate crisis, period. There is no arguing about it. People will like to argue about it, but there's no credible way to argue about that. And like I feel that capitalism is a delusion. It's like the most delusional thing I have ever experienced in my so far not very long life. But I feel that a lot of people think capitalism is not only inevitable, but the only realistic way of looking at the world. And I think that is, frankly, like kind of laughable because how can it? I think the only realistic thing is to change something because we've seen how this system has put a lot of people, including each of us, in the way of harm. And it's unrealistic to think we can continue on with this system. So I feel like the most realistic thing, honestly, is climate action. I'm like, there's nothing more
Yeah.
realistic than like there's a problem, we have to solve it. There's a challenge, we have to rise to the occasion. Like that is what it means to be realistic. It's not realistic to say there is a challenge, let me pretend it doesn't exist. Like
Yeah.
that's not realistic at all. And I think that's
Yeah.
what like people who continue to defend capitalism will say. And then the other thing that they'll say is like, well, if not this, then what? And I
Yeah.
find it very interesting when people ask rhetorical questions because in the face of a problem, why would you ask a rhetorical question? Like ask an actual question. If
Yes.
not this, then what? I don't know. Let's find out. Like,
Yeah.
let's
Let's
experiment.
try
Let's
like a
look.
bunch of things and see what sticks. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I find this interesting because it kind of goes back to the point of silo slash like I don't know if you read Cast by Isabel Wilkerson,
No, I
but
watched Origin, but I haven't read the actual book.
love Origin. That
Yeah,
movie
yeah.
changed my life completely, but conversation for another day.
Yeah, so
Um,
good.
and she talks about how underdogs slash omegas in society are kind of not, you can't get rid of that. There's always going to be
Mhm.
hierarchy within humans. We're always going to be comparative beings. We're social beings. Can't really get rid of that. But something that you said to me that stuck with me a lot was in our previous conversation, you talked about how, yes, there are going to be underdogs, but that doesn't mean we can't improve the baseline, which that really, I feel like even it's a simple concept, but that really stuck with me. And can we like talk about that a little bit more? Like, and that divide just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Like, how do we grapple with that?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily feel I agree, like I don't necessarily feel like there is a society that I can personally imagine where everyone is just 100% equal in every single way. I
There's
think
just no way. There's too much complexity in humans.
there's too much complex and also like how do you define equality and
Yeah.
equity and things like I don't know because I think there's always going to be somebody who's like a little more athletic or like whatever. There's
Yeah.
so many different things, right? So many different elements of what it means to be human. I think that what I mean when I say like the baseline has to improve is that I don't want to live in a world where I'm worried that if I don't work my ass off for some random other person who's making money off of my labor, that if I don't do that, I'm going to be out in the streets, like unhoused or, with food insecurity or whatever. And again, like I personally am privileged enough to know that I have a community that would stop that from happening. But I think everyone should have that level of of privilege. Like I think that that should just be the norm. And I think a lot of people feel that humans are not motivated without that fear factor, which
Hmm.
is wild to me because I really feel like you must really have met the worst humans if that's how you
Yeah,
feel, right? Like if you think
yeah.
that humans are not motivated to innovate and create change and create without the threat of houselessness and hunger and like death and whatever, like maybe that was true thousands of years ago when, you know, humans lived in really harsh conditions and did not have the sort of comforts that we have now. But isn't, I feel like the same people who argue that are also the first people who will be like, you know, like innovation and human evolution and whatever. And I'm like, okay, well, if we can evolve technologically and innovate technologically, surely we can evolve
Well,
and
technology
innovate
is
in our
only created by
spirit.
humans, right? Like we come together as a collective for the things that we care about. So,
Yeah.
unfortunately, though, I agree with you. I know people who have just, when you're around people you don't feel like you can trust, that mistrust just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And quite frankly, you need to be in societies or communities of people who just make you feel like it's just, there's no conditions, there's no transactions. It is purely just, we are all doing this for the betterment of all of us, not just for one of us.
Yeah, and to be clear, like I don't believe in utopia. Like I think that
Yeah.
utopia is not only unattainable, but like it's sort of a silly concept because like who defines utopia, right? Like I think that if there's some people who I don't think I'd want to live in their definition of utopia, you know? Like
Yeah.
today it occurred to me I was like I think maybe we are living in the utopia of like rich white men right now. You know, and
Yeah.
I it's not working for me. I don't want
Yeah.
it. So I'm not
It's so
advocating for
subjective.
you know, it's subjective, yeah. And so I'm not advocating for like utopia. I'm just saying like if we're truly a developed society, then we can do better. You know, like we can live in a world where you don't have to worry about baseline stuff. Like that to me would be a 21st century kind of human life where you're like, there is plenty for everyone to just be baseline, fed, clothed, housed. So let's just take that off the table as a concern.
Yeah.
And people can still, I mean, you know, I don't know how I'm going to feel about this down the line, but in this particular like initial situation, I'm just saying take care of that. And there can still be millionaires and stuff like that. But like, do we need billionaires? Like, I don't think
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
really necessary. I don't know. I don't know. That just seems like a no-brainer to me, you know? Like I feel like in kindergarten you learn that if you're doing an art project and someone takes all the crayons, you're like they're being a hog and like no one's
That is
hogging. So
true.
why like did they not like graduate kindergarten? Like you don't hog,
Honestly,
you
I
share.
feel like
Like
so many adult concepts can be translated to kindergarten games.
yeah. It's
And I
so
think that
weird.
kindergartens are smarter because they just have more empathy and awareness for the
Yeah.
world. And we're just more cynical and jaded that everyone is
Yeah.
terrible. And it's like, no, that's not
100%.
actually true.
Yeah, it's just super weird. I'm like, I feel like it's like unnecessary, you know? And yeah. I don't know, but people will love to convince you that if you don't have this threat of whatever, like people aren't going to create anything. I'm like, maybe that was true back in the day, but surely we've evolved beyond that.
It's like the
I
survivalist mentality.
Yeah, and I also like the other thing I'm thinking of as we're talking is I was learning like I don't remember where I was learning this, so if I'm quoting someone without credit, I apologize, but somewhere I was learning about sort of like different interpretations of Darwin and how
Hmm.
Darwin interpreted his data. This is another example of how like science is a narrative,
Wait, I
right?
think I know what you're going to say because I've read this before, but yes, continue.
Yeah, where it's like he went to the Galapagos and he was like, survival of the fittest, and everything's a competition, and the strongest survive. And other people are like, okay, but you're only measuring situations where people and or species have to compete. What about all the situations where species avoid competition by cooperating? That those species co-evolve, right?
Hmm.
Like there's evolution survival of the fittest when you cannot avoid competition. But
Yes.
there's plenty of species that avoid competition by cooperating and then evolve together. And because of that, have sometimes relationships that go back millions of years, right? Like leafcutter ants or like mushrooms and trees, right? Like these are relationships that,
That's
or
giving braiding sweetgrass, like
yeah,
how
yeah,
the like life is all
right.
so dependent on each other.
Exactly, like lichen, you know, like I just think there's like so many examples in nature of the way that organisms have been like we actually don't need to compete. We can just work together. Or even like the three sisters, corn, bean, squash, right? Like the way that they
Mhm.
figure out sunlight and soil together. Like, I'm like, Darwin did not notice any of that because he came in with a perspective and he interpreted his data based on that perspective. And I'm not saying that like survival of the fittest is not a reality also. I'm just saying that no one has been talking in the mainstream about cooperation as a survival tactic, which it also
Yeah.
is, right? Like we think the only way to survive is competition, but actually cooperation is an even smarter survival tactic because you co-evolve, you both get better, everything's great, you know? Not
You
everything's
know,
great, but
that's
you know.
so funny that you said that because I read this book last year by Jonathan Haidt. It's called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided on Religion and Politics. And he actually
Mm,
brings up this Darwin evolution theory and how actually he had a lesser known theory which talks about collectivism and how
mm.
humans or like our species has evolved actually to be more of a collective being. But that did not get as much love
It's not
from
as
the
clickbaity.
mainstream.
Back in the day,
Exactly.
clickbait, yeah.
It's not the survivalism thing that we've been
Mm,
seeing. This is more around how, and it might be more like tribalism, but even to a certain extent, there is a form of community which is not as much explained from the survival of fittest theory, right? And I
mm,
just found that interesting because it's true because like even science itself is opinionated, right?
Yeah,
So
you gotta send me that book.
it was one of the best reads of last year, and I had like five best reads of last year, so
Okay,
I will
good to
definitely
know.
send it
Yeah,
over
send
to
me the
you.
name after. I definitely want to add that to my
Yes.
to be read.
I will. Well, this was so wonderful, Sanjana. We're approaching the end of the interview, but before I end, there is one question that I want to ask you,
Mhm.
which is, what is the number one thing you think of when you hear the word money?
The number one thing I think of when I hear the word money right now, to be honest, is the rising cost of living.
Inflation is expensive.
No, I think the number one thing, like when you say money, my first thought is everything costs so much money. That's like
My
my
eggs
number
are
one thought.
$10. That's not okay.
Literally, I'm like, it's crazy, it's crazy. I do feel like right now that's top of mind. But something you had asked me earlier that I kind of want to bring back because I don't know that I fully touched on it was you had mentioned the word wealth.
Hmm.
And I think when if I were to take some initiative to change that question a little bit, when I think of the word wealth, recently a friend of mine named Isaiah Hernandez, he runs this platform called Queer Brown Vegan, and he talks
I've
a
heard
lot
of
about
him. Yes.
yeah, he has some great content. Definitely check it out. But he talks a lot about this concept that he calls ecological wealth, and I've been thinking about that and just about the broadening of the definition of wealth because I think when we
Hmm.
think about wealth, we think about money, and that's part of wealth is like financial wealth, but there's so many other kinds of wealth. There's spiritual wealth. There's wealth in love. There's wealth of the heart. There's generosity, which I think is a kind of wealth also. There's a wealth of the mind. There's a wealth of, again, ecology. There's just so many kinds of really what is like abundance and the sort of maintaining and developing and caring for abundance, which I
Yes.
think is really what wealth is meant to be. But in our society, we've sort of narrowed it to just this like one
Monetary
very small,
value.
yeah, and like to the most boring of those things, honestly. Like I would so much rather talk about trees and my love life
Hmm.
and my spirit than talk about, cash transactions and the stock
Yeah.
market. So I
Yeah.
feel like I've been thinking a lot, like when I think about money, I'm like thinking about cost. But when I think about wealth, I think about, what we have and what we're given rather than what we have to pay for.
Yes. That makes me so happy because I actually interviewed like 10 friends about 2 years ago because I was curious about their relationships with money. That's kind of what started all of this, everything
Mhm.
that I've built so far today. But I was so curious to hear what people had to say about defining wealth because I would say wealth and they would say something around the lines of security or
Mhm.
money or whatever. And then I would say abundance. And they would mention things like love. They would mention things like family. They would mention things like having freedom of time to spend with loved ones. And it was really, I didn't realize how much that definition was so divided for so many people when in
Mhm.
reality it kind of are like
Yeah.
interlinked.
Yeah. I know. It's like I'm really trying to be holistically wealthy, you know? That's what I
Yes,
want.
as you should
Holistic
be, as
wealth.
we should all be. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, this was amazing, Sanjana. I
Thank you
appreciate
so
you
much,
so
Neha.
much.
This was, yeah, and you asked such beautiful questions, and I really love where your focus is and how you tease all these ideas out through really interesting concepts, because I do think that money is something that touches everything and is really
It
hard to
does.
talk about. And I think you ask really compassionate and well thought out questions about it. So thank you so much for all of your love that went into this conversation.
That makes me so happy. I could honestly, it could make me tear up right now. Thank you so
Do
much.
it.
I really appreciate it.